Eleanor Voss slammed the ledger shut the moment Gerald Hargrove called her a charity case. She did not raise her voice. She did not flinch. She stood up from that kitchen chair, looked Gerald Hargrove dead in the eye across his brother's table, and said, "Say that again, and I walk out that door. Keep your money, and let every business on Sherman Street know exactly how you treat people you consider beneath you." The room went absolutely silent. Caleb Hargrove set down his coffee cup, and Gerald Hargrove, for the first time in longer than anyone in that room could remember, had nothing to say. If that opening just stopped your heart, you are exactly where you belong. Subscribe to this channel right now and hit that notification bell. I release new stories every week, and I do not want you to miss a single one. Drop your city in the comments below. I want to see how far this story travels. Now let's go back to where it all began, because what happened in that ranch house did not start with a slammed ledger. It started with a letter, a debt, and a father who could not look his daughter in the eye. The letter arrived on a Thursday. Eleanor was at the table working through 3 columns of overdue accounts when her father's boots hit the stairs. Slower than usual, heavier than the day before. The particular rhythm of a man carrying something he did not want to deliver. She set her pen down before he opened the door. "Papa!" Warren Voss was 58 years old and walked like 70. He had been a sharp man once, a lawyer in St. Louis with a pressed collar and a reputation for reading contracts the way preachers read scripture. Every word, every silence, every comma that could turn a promise into a trap. 4 years ago, he had trusted a land deed without verifying one line. That was all it had taken. The house went. The practice went. They came west to Deadwood, Dakota Territory, in the autumn of 1883 with $43 and an unspoken agreement between them that Philadelphia would not be mentioned again. Warren set the letter on the table. He did not sit. His hand stayed flat on the envelope like he was trying to hold it still. "It is from Gerald Hargrove," he said. Eleanor looked at the envelope and did not touch it. "What does he want?" Warren pulled up the chair across from her and sat. He folded his hands. When he looked up, she saw the expression she had been dreading for 6 months. Not grief, not shame, but the look of a man about to ask his daughter to pay for his mistakes. "His younger brother," Warren said. "Caleb Hargrove. Owns the cattle ranch out past the ridge. Gerald has been trying to get the boy married for 3 years. Sent him 5 women from good families back east, and the boy refused every one. Gerald needs Caleb connected to the Alcott family out of Chicago. They hold a land grant Gerald wants for his freight route. The Alcott girl was the last one Caleb refused." "And?" Warren was quiet. "Papa, and?" "Gerald believes," Warren said carefully, "that if he sends Caleb a woman with no money, no connections, no family name worth speaking, someone so obviously beneath consideration that the offer itself becomes an insult, Caleb will be humiliated into reconsidering the Alcott girl out of sheer pride." He stopped. "He wants to send you, Eleanor." The fire in the small stove cracked and settled. "He will clear every debt we owe," Warren continued, his voice dropping lower with every word. "The room, the store credit, everything. If you agree to go to the Hargrove Ranch and present yourself as a marriage prospect." "And when Caleb refuses me, as Gerald expects, do we still get the money?" Warren closed his eyes briefly. "Yes. He calls it a service rendered, regardless of outcome." Eleanor was quiet for a moment. She looked at the account ledger in front of her, at the columns she'd been fighting for 6 months, the numbers that kept refusing to close. She thought about the woodpile behind the building, 3 weeks of fuel at most. And the fact that she had not told her father yet because there were only so many pieces of bad news a person could carry at one time. "How much do we owe?" she asked. $87. She picked up Gerald Hargrove's letter and read every sentence twice, with the same attention she brought to every document that crossed her hands. His handwriting was precise and confident, the handwriting of a man who was never wrong and knew it. "I will go," she said. "Eleanor, I will go, Papa. The money clears whether he refuses me or not. That is the only number that matters right now." "You are not a transaction," Warren said, his voice cracking on the last word. "I know what I am." She set the letter back on the table and picked up her pen. "The question is whether Caleb Hargrove does." She opened the ledger. "I am going to finish these accounts first." Warren put his face in his hands. His shoulders shook once, and then he was still. She packed that night without ceremony. The faded dark brown dress, worn at the elbows but still holding its shape. Her mother's hairbrush wrapped in a handkerchief. And her notebook, the one thick with 3 years of account work, contract language she had taught herself from borrowed books, margin notes in her own hand across 100 pages of careful self-education. She did not pack it because she expected to use it. She packed it because it was the one thing she owned that proved she was more than what Gerald Hargrove's letter had implied. The carriage arrived at 7 Saturday morning. Eleanor carried her own bag down the stairs. Warren stood at the bottom in his good coat, because that was the kind of man he still was, regardless of everything. He took both her hands. His grip was still firm, still the grip of the lawyer. "You are worth more than this errand," he said. "Whatever happens in that house, whatever that man says or does not say, you remember that." "I always remember it," Eleanor said. "The problem is that no one else does." She kissed his cheek and walked out into the cold. The carriage pulled into the Hargrove ranch yard just before 9. Eleanor stepped down without waiting for the driver's hand and looked at what Caleb Hargrove had built. She looked at it the way she looked at ledgers, clear-eyed, without sentiment, counting what was real. 2-story timber house, solid and square. 4 outbuildings. A barn built for serious use. Fencing that ran in both directions further than she could track. Whoever had built this had known exactly what they were doing and had done it without apology. A man stood on the porch watching her cross the yard. Tall, lean through the shoulder, the way working men are lean. Not the leanness of someone who skips meals, but the leanness of someone who has not stopped moving in a decade. Dark hair under a brown hat. Dark eyes. A light shirt with the sleeves rolled to the forearm despite the cold. He watched her with an expression she could not categorize. Not hostile. Not warm. Not the polite performance of a man preparing to be courteous to someone he intended to dismiss. Just watching. Before she reached the porch steps, the front door opened behind him, and Gerald Hargrove came out. Gerald was older than his brother by 10 years and broader by 30 pounds, dressed in the kind of clothes that announced money before he opened his mouth. He had the easy confidence of a man who had not been told no in a very long time. And when he saw Eleanor crossing that yard, he smiled. A private, satisfied smile that confirmed everything she had already understood about why she was here. "Miss Voss," he came down the steps with his hand extended. "Welcome. I trust the ride was comfortable." "It was fine." She shook his hand once and released it. "Caleb," Gerald said, turning to his brother with the particular warmth of a man presenting something he found amusing. "This is Miss Eleanor Voss, Warren Voss's daughter. You may recall the name. Small law practice out of St. Louis before some unfortunate circumstances brought them west." He let that settle for exactly 1 beat too long. "Miss Voss has graciously agreed to be considered." She watched Caleb Hargrove's jaw tighten. A small movement, barely visible, not directed at her, directed at his brother. Caleb came down the steps. Up close, the dark eyes were sharper, the eyes of a man who was always counting, always measuring what was true against what was being performed for his benefit. He looked at her face, not her dress, not her bag, her face. "Miss Voss," he said, low, level, no ceremony. "You had a long ride. Come inside." He turned and went back up the steps without waiting for Gerald to finish arranging his expression. Eleanor followed him. Gerald fell into step beside her, dropping his voice. "Do not take his manner personally, Miss Voss. Caleb is a plain-spoken man." "So am I," Eleanor said pleasantly, and walked through the door. The main room was large and spare, built for use rather than impression, and had become comfortable through years of actual living rather than deliberate decoration. A fire burned in the stone hearth. A long wooden table occupied the center. Against the far wall stood a woman with arms crossed and the expression of someone who had seen everything and was withholding judgment on this particular development until further notice. "Nora Blackwell," Caleb said, hanging his hat by the door. "She runs this house, including, historically, me." Nora was perhaps 55, gray threaded through dark hair, with eyes that were simultaneously the warmest and most penetrating Eleanor had encountered in recent memory. She looked Eleanor over once, from boot to crown. "You're cold," Nora said. "Sit, I'll get coffee." "Thank you." "Don't thank me yet. I haven't decided what I think of you." She turned toward the kitchen without any particular hostility. Eleanor understood immediately that this was simply how Nora Blackwell spoke to everyone, and felt something loosen slightly in her chest for the first time all morning. Gerald had positioned himself near the fireplace, hands clasped behind his back, smiling at the room. "Well," he said, "why don't you two sit and get acquainted? I have some correspondence." "You can do it somewhere else," Caleb said. Gerald blinked. "I beg your—" "You heard me." Gerald looked at his brother for a long moment. Then, with the carefully managed expression of a man selecting his battles, he nodded and walked down the hallway. Caleb pulled out a chair at the table and looked at Eleanor. She sat. He sat across from her, leaned back, and looked at her the way he had in the yard, directly, without the social performance most men wrapped around a first meeting. "My brother tell you what this was about?" he said. "Enough of it." "Tell me what you know." Eleanor folded her hands on the table. "You refused 5 women from respectable families in 3 years. Gerald needs you connected to the Alcott family because of a land grant. You refused the Alcott girl. His theory is that sending someone obviously unsuitable," she paused one beat, "meaning me, will embarrass you back toward the Alcott offer out of pride." Caleb watched her through all of it without expression. "You know you're the joke," he said. Not unkind, just direct. "I know I'm the intended joke," Eleanor said. "Whether that's what I turn out to be is a different question." Something moved behind his eyes. Not a smile, but the possibility of one. "Why'd you come?" he asked, knowing what it was. "My father owes $87 he cannot pay. Gerald's letter promised to clear the debt regardless of your decision. I came because even your refusal, which we both understand is the expected outcome, pays my father's debt. I am not going to pretend otherwise." Caleb looked at her for a moment. Then he looked toward the hallway where Gerald had gone. "He told you the debt clears either way?" "His letter said so." "Of course it did." He turned back to her. "What do you do, Miss Voss, for work?" The question caught her slightly off balance, not because it was wrong, but because it was the question a man asked when he was actually listening. "Bookkeeping. Accounts management for 3 businesses on Sherman Street." I review contracts when asked. You trained for that? I trained myself. 4 years of general schooling, then my mother died and I went to work. The rest came from books and from doing it. Nora arrived with 2 tin mugs of coffee, set them down without comment, and looked at Caleb. Gerald's in your study. Of course he is. Want me to deal with it? Not yet. He picked up his coffee, looked at Eleanor. I have a problem. Tell me. My bookkeeper quit in September. Gerald sent a replacement from Denver. He paused. I sent him back after 4 days. Why? He was changing numbers. In whose favor? Not mine. His eyes were steady on hers. I have 3 months of unreviewed accounts. Gerald keeps offering to send his own people to go through them. And you don't want Gerald's people in your accounts, Eleanor said. Would you? She thought about Gerald's smile in the yard. The private, satisfied smile of a man who had arranged everything to his own advantage and was enjoying watching it execute. She thought about the letter, the precise language, the way it had been engineered to make her father feel grateful and her feel small. No, she said, I would not. Caleb stood, went to the cabinet against the wall, and returned with a ledger. He set it in front of her. July, August, September. Eleanor pulled it toward her and opened it. She looked at the first page for 20 seconds. Column 4, third entry, she pointed. The quantity figure doesn't match the unit price calculation. Someone carried a number incorrectly. She looked up. Either by accident or they knew exactly what they were doing. Caleb looked at the entry, said nothing, but he did not look away from it. Keep going, he said. She turned the page. He stayed where he was, across the table, and watched, not watching her with the measuring look men used when they were deciding what a woman was worth. Watching the way a man watches someone work when he is paying genuine attention to the work itself. She found 7 discrepancies in 40 minutes. She identified 2 patterns that were not accidents. She was halfway through September when Nora appeared at her elbow and set bread and butter on the table. Eleanor ate without looking up. She did not notice that Caleb had stopped drinking his coffee. She did not notice that he had leaned forward, both forearms on the table, his full attention on the marks she was making in the margins of his accounts. She did not notice the particular quality of the silence around her. Not the silence of a man tolerating her presence, but the silence of a man who had found something unexpected and was being careful not to disturb it. Down the hall, a door opened. Gerald's footsteps came toward them, confident and unhurried. Eleanor did not look up. Caleb turned his chair, a small, deliberate movement, so that his shoulder was between Eleanor and the hallway. It was not dramatic. It was quiet and certain, the way a man steps in front of something that matters without making a speech about it. Gerald walked into the room and stopped. He looked at Eleanor. He looked at the ledger open in front of her, the pencil in her hand, the marks in the margin. He looked at the plate of bread that said she had been there long enough to be fed and had been too focused to stop working. Well, he said smoothly. Getting acquainted, I see. She's working, Caleb said. Gerald's smile stayed where it was. Of course. I only wanted to check that Miss Voss had everything she has everything she needs. Gerald clasped his hands behind his back. He looked at Eleanor with the careful recalibration of a man whose careful plan had developed an unexpected variable. And Eleanor felt his gaze the way you feel a cold draft finding the gap under a door. You cannot see it, but you know exactly where it's coming from. She turned another page, marked another discrepancy, and without lifting her eyes from the ledger, Eleanor Voss said in a voice as level and clear as a column of numbers that had finally balanced. "Mr. Hargrove, the one on your left. I found it." Caleb leaned forward and looked at where her pencil was pointing. Gerald Hargrove stood in the doorway of his brother's house and looked at the poorest girl in Deadwood, taking apart his brother's accounts line by line with a pencil and a face like carved stone. And for the first time since he had written that letter with such confidence and satisfaction, Gerald Hargrove understood that he had made a serious miscalculation. Not about Caleb. About her. Gerald did not move from the doorway. He stood with his hands clasped behind his back and his smile still arranged on his face. But the smile had changed in a way that was difficult to name. It was still present, still technically warm, but something behind it had shifted. The way a lamp looks different when the flame starts running low. "What did you find?" Caleb asked. He was looking at Eleanor's pencil, not at his brother. "This entry." Eleanor kept her voice even. She turned the ledger so Caleb could see clearly. "September 14th. Your supplier invoice for feed grain lists 40 bushels delivered at $1.10 per bushel. But your receiving log, this column here, confirms 31 bushels. You were billed for 9 bushels that were never delivered." She moved her pencil 2 lines down. "And here again, September 22nd. Same supplier, same pattern." Caleb's jaw set. "How much total?" "In September alone, counting both entries, just under $18 overbilled." She turned back 2 months. "I would need to go through July and August line by line to give you a complete number. But given the pattern I am seeing, I would estimate you are looking at somewhere between $40 and $60 over the quarter." The fire in the hearth popped once and went quiet. "That is a serious accusation," Gerald said from the doorway. His voice was smooth and careful, the voice of a man who had not survived 30 years in business by reacting before he was ready. "Against a supplier your ranch has worked with for some time, if I recall correctly." "It is not an accusation," Eleanor said, without looking up from the ledger. "It is arithmetic. The numbers are either correct or they are not." She turned one more page. "These are not." "Miss Voss." Gerald moved into the room now, coming around the end of the table to where he could see the ledger properly. Eleanor felt him looking over her shoulder and did not shift an inch. "I appreciate your thoroughness, but accounting discrepancies can have many innocent explanations. Recording errors, miscommunication between the same recording error in the same column with the same supplier in the same direction on 11 separate occasions across 3 months is not a miscommunication," Eleanor said. She set her pencil down and looked up at Gerald for the first time since he had walked back into the room. "It is a method." Silence. Caleb stood up from the table. He picked up the ledger, looked at the entries Eleanor had marked, and then set it back down with the controlled care of a man who was angry and had made a decision not to express it in this room at this moment. He looked at his brother. "You recommended that supplier," he said. "I recommend a great many things in the course of helping you run this operation," Gerald said. "That does not mean you recommended him specifically last spring, when my previous supplier's contract ended." Caleb's voice was not loud. It was the opposite of loud. It was the kind of quiet that filled a room the way water fills a low place, completely and without effort. "Henderson, out of Rapid City. You said Henderson was unreliable and you had someone better." "Caleb, I was trying to help." "Were you?" It was not a question. Gerald heard that and adjusted. He straightened, set his expression into something more serious, more injured, and looked at his brother with the eyes of a man who had been misunderstood. "I think," Gerald said carefully, that before we make any accusations based on a few marked entries in a ledger, reviewed, I might add, by a woman who arrived here this morning with no credentials whatsoever." "I have credentials," Eleanor said. "Miss Voss." Gerald's voice took on the particular patient condescension of a man explaining something to someone he considered decorative. "I am sure you are quite capable with numbers. But there is a difference between keeping accounts for a few small businesses on a mining town street and evaluating the complex operations of a ranch this size." Eleanor looked at him. She did not look away, did not blink, did not perform any of the small social retreats women were expected to perform when men used that tone. "Tell me the difference," she said. Gerald blinked. "I beg your pardon?" "Tell me the specific accounting difference between what I do and what you are describing. Because from where I am sitting, a fraudulent billing entry in a feed grain invoice reads the same whether the ledger belongs to a dry goods store or a cattle ranch." She tapped the page with one finger. "The number is wrong. The pattern is deliberate. That is not a matter of scale or complexity. That is a matter of someone believing that no one was paying close enough attention to notice." Gerald opened his mouth. "And they were right," Eleanor continued, her voice unchanged. "Until this morning." Nora appeared in the kitchen doorway. She had a dish towel in her hands and an expression on her face that suggested she had been listening from the kitchen for the past 10 minutes and was entirely satisfied with what she had heard. She looked at Caleb. "You want more coffee?" "Yes," Caleb said, without taking his eyes off his brother. "Miss Voss?" "Please," Eleanor said. Gerald looked between the three of them. He was a man who understood rooms, who held them, who was losing them, and he understood this one clearly enough. He pulled out the chair at the head of the table, the chair that was furthest from Eleanor, and positioned him at the end of the space, as though he could reclaim authority through geography, and sat down. "All right," he said, moderating his tone into something reasonable and conciliatory, the tone of a man shifting strategies without conceding the field. "Let's say, for the sake of discussion, that there are irregularities in the Henderson invoices. What would you propose as a next step, Miss Voss, since you seem to have thoughts on the matter?" Eleanor recognized the move. Give the inconvenient person the floor, let them speak, then dismantle whatever they say at leisure. She had seen it done to her father twice in courtrooms before everything fell apart. "I would pull every Henderson invoice going back to the start of the contract," she said. "Cross-reference each one against the receiving logs. Calculate the total overbilling. Then I would send a formal written notice to Henderson, itemizing the discrepancies and demanding repayment with documentation attached, before involving anyone outside this ranch." She paused. "I would also look very carefully at who introduced this particular supplier, and whether there is any financial relationship between that person and Henderson that has not been disclosed." The room was absolutely still. Caleb looked at her with something she had not seen on a man's face in a very long time. Not admiration exactly, because admiration had a softness to it that this did not. This was the look of a man recalibrating. The look of a man who had expected one thing and encountered something substantially different, and was honest enough with himself to register the difference. Gerald's face had gone very carefully neutral. "That is a rather dramatic interpretation of a routine accounting question," he said. "It is a routine accounting response to a pattern of fraud," Eleanor said. "The drama is in the fraud, not the response." Gerald stood up. He buttoned his jacket with the deliberate movements of a man reassembling his authority around himself, like a garment. "I think," he said, addressing Caleb now and not Eleanor, "that we have all had a long morning, and perhaps it would be better to continue this conversation after lunch, when everyone has had a chance to—" "I need those contracts," Caleb said. Gerald stopped. "I beg your pardon?" "The Henderson contracts. and any correspondence relating to the supplier recommendation. I need them." Caleb's eyes were on his brother, and they did not waver. "Today." Something moved across Gerald's face. Very fast, very controlled, gone before it fully arrived. "Those documents are in my office in Deadwood." "Then you can ride to get them." "Caleb." Gerald's voice softened into something almost paternal, almost wounded. "I came out here to help you, to solve a problem I thought you were ignoring. If I was wrong about Miss Foss—" He gestured toward Eleanor with the gracious magnanimity of a man granting a concession. "If she turns out to be more capable than I anticipated, then I am glad of it, and I apologize for underestimating her. But do not let a morning's conversation turn into something it does not need to be." "The contracts," Caleb said. "Today." Gerald held his brother's gaze for a long moment. Then he nodded once, picked up his hat from the hook by the door, and walked out. They heard his boots on the porch, heard him call to the driver in the yard, heard the carriage shift and move and fade down the track toward the ridge. Nora set fresh coffee on the table. She looked at Eleanor. "You hungry?" "I am fine, thank you." "That was not what I asked." Nora went back to the kitchen. Eleanor looked down at the ledger still open in front of her. Her hands were steady. They had been steady through the entire conversation, which she recognized as the particular steadiness that came not from confidence, but from having nothing left to lose, and therefore nothing worth protecting by being afraid. Caleb sat back down across from her. He was quiet for a moment, looking at the marked pages between them. "You knew he would push back on it," he said. "Of course." "You were ready for it." "I have spent 3 years sitting across tables from men who believed that speaking with certainty was the same thing as being correct," Eleanor said. "I have learned to let the numbers answer for themselves." Caleb turned the ledger toward himself and looked at the September entries again. She watched him read, not the quick scan of a man satisfying himself that someone had done their job, but the close reading of a man who wanted to understand it for himself. She respected that. "How long would it take," he said, "to go through all 3 months properly, every entry? If I have access to the receiving logs and the original invoices alongside the ledger, 2 days. Possibly 3 if the filing is not organized." "The filing is not organized," Caleb said. He looked up. "Nora knows where everything is." "Then 3 days." He was quiet again. The fire had settled into a steady, low burn. Outside she could hear the sounds of the ranch, men's voices, the movement of horses, the particular rhythm of a working place going about its day, indifferent to the conversations happening inside. "Why did you bring the notebook?" Caleb asked. Eleanor looked up. "I beg your pardon?" "When you came in this morning, you had a notebook in your bag. You set it on the table next to you before you opened the ledger. You did not use it, but you kept it where you could reach it." He was looking at her with that direct, measuring look. "Why?" She had not realized he had noticed that. She considered the question honestly, because she had learned in the past 3 years that honest answers, even inconvenient ones, were almost always more useful than constructed ones. "Because it has 3 years of my work in it," she said. "Every account I have balanced, every contract I have reviewed, every error I have caught and documented. I brought it because—" She stopped, chose the next words precisely. "Because I knew what I was being sent here for. And I wanted to have something with me that reminded me of what I actually am, regardless of what Gerald Hargrove's letter said I was." Caleb looked at her for a long moment. He had the kind of face that did not give things away easily. Not cold, but contained. The face of a man who had learned that the world paid more attention to what it saw than what you told it, and had made a practice of controlling what it saw. But something in his expression shifted now, just slightly, in a way she could not fully categorize. "My brother told your father you were being considered as a marriage prospect," he said. "That is what the letter said." Yes. I want to be straight with you about something. Please. I refused those 5 women Gerald sent because every single one of them looked at this ranch the way a person looks at a bank statement, Caleb said. They asked about the acreage before they asked about the work. They talked about what they could bring to the arrangement, connections, family names, money. And not one of them asked a single question about what the days out here actually look like. He leaned forward slightly. Gerald believes I am being stubborn, impractical, sentimental even. He said the last word with a faint dryness. He thinks I am holding out for something that does not exist. And what is that? Eleanor asked. A partner, Caleb said simply. Not a decoration, not a social connection, not a business arrangement wearing a wedding ring. Someone who can sit across a table and do the work. He looked at the open ledger between them. Turns out that is a difficult thing to find when your brother is doing the looking. Eleanor was quiet for a moment. I came here to be refused, she said. I want you to know that I am aware of that. I did not come with expectations. I know why you came, Caleb said. You told me straight when you sat down, and I respect that more than you know. He paused. But you have been here 3 hours, and in those 3 hours, you have found what my last 2 bookkeepers missed entirely. You have said exactly what you thought to my brother's face without flinching, and you have not once asked me about the acreage. Eleanor looked at him. How many acres? She asked. Something crossed his face that was, undeniably, a smile. Not broad, not performed, the real kind, the kind that arrived without permission. 4,612, he said. That is a great deal of feed grain, Eleanor said. He laughed. It was a short sound, surprised out of him, genuine, and it changed his face entirely, the way a single window opening changes the quality of light in a room. Nora appeared in the kitchen doorway again with a plate. She looked at Caleb laughing, and Eleanor sitting straight across from him with the open ledger between them, and Nora Blackwell, who had worked in this house for 6 years and had watched 5 women arrive in fine clothes and leave in varying degrees of disappointment, allowed herself one small private expression that was gone from her face before either of them looked up. She set the plate on the table between them. Sliced bread, cold roast beef, sharp cheese. Eat, she said to Eleanor. You have 3 months of accounts to finish, and I am not running a house where people work through lunch. Yes, ma'am, Eleanor said. Nora pointed at Caleb. You too. You've been up since 4, and you get unpleasant when your blood sugar drops. And I am the one who has to manage the consequences. I do not get unpleasant, Caleb said. You absolutely get unpleasant, Nora said, and went back to the kitchen. Eleanor picked up her pencil and a piece of bread at the same time, and turned back to the ledger. Caleb reached across, turned the plate closer to her side of the table, and picked up the ledger to read the August entries himself. They worked like that through the noon hour, the fire steady at their backs, the sounds of the ranch coming in muffled through the walls, the plate between them diminishing slowly. They did not speak much, only when Eleanor found something and indicated it, only when Caleb had a question about a specific entry. But the silence between them was not the silence of 2 strangers sitting in the same room. It was the silence of 2 people who had found the same rhythm without discussing it, who had simply begun working and discovered, without ceremony or announcement, that they worked well together. Outside, the afternoon light moved across the ridge in the long, slow way of autumn days that knew their own hours were short. Eleanor turned to the final pages of September and found what she had suspected was there since the second discrepancy. One entry, near the bottom of the last page, that was not a billing error or a quantity adjustment. It was a payment, a separate payment, small enough to overlook, large enough to matter, made out not to Henderson Grain Supply, but to a private individual. The name was initialed only, G.H., She looked at it for a long moment. Then she set her pencil down very quietly and looked up at Caleb Hargrove across the table and understood, with a particular clarity that came from 3 years of reading documents that people had hoped no one would read carefully, that what she had found this morning was not simply a billing discrepancy. It was the reason Gerald Hargrove had needed his brother distracted. It was the reason Gerald had needed a bookkeeper he controlled in this office. And it was the reason Gerald Hargrove had sent the poorest, most dismissible girl he could find from Deadwood, not just to embarrass his brother into a convenient marriage, but to make absolutely certain that no one with real eyes and real skill would ever sit down at this table and look at these numbers. Eleanor closed the ledger. She folded her hands on top of it, and she sat very still, and she thought carefully about what came next. Caleb saw her hands, not the ledger, not the closed cover, not the careful way she had set her pencil down. He saw her hands, folded flat on top of the leather binding, with the deliberate stillness of a person who had just found something that required them to be very careful about what they did next. He had spent enough years reading cattle and weather and the faces of men who worked for him to know the difference between a person who had finished a task and a person who had stopped because they had found something they were not yet ready to say out loud. He set down the August pages he had been reading. "What is it?" he said. Not a question. Eleanor looked at him across the table. She held his gaze for a moment, measuring something. Not him, he understood, but the situation. Measuring what the information was worth, and what it would cost, and who it would land on when it hit the ground. "I need to ask you something first," she said, "and I need you to answer me honestly." "All right." "Gerald." "The freight business, the mining interests, the arrangements he manages out of Denver." She chose her words with the care of a woman building a case rather than a conversation. "Does he have access to your ranch accounts? Not these ledgers, your bank accounts, your holdings." Caleb's expression did not change, but something behind it sharpened. "He has signatory authority on one account, a joint operating account we set up 3 years ago when he fronted capital for the barn expansion. He was supposed to be removed from it when I repaid the loan." "Was he removed?" A beat of silence. "I sent the paperwork to the Deadwood Bank in July," Caleb said. "I assumed it had been processed." "Have you confirmed that it was processed?" The silence this time was longer. Eleanor watched the information settle over him the way she had watched bad numbers settle over business owners on Sherman Street. The moment when a man stopped arguing with the arithmetic and started understanding what it actually meant. "Show me," he said. She opened the ledger to the last page of September and turned it to face him. She pointed to the entry near the bottom, the separate payment, the initialed name, the amount that was small enough to overlook and large enough to matter. Caleb leaned forward and read it. He read it twice. Then he sat back in his chair and was very still for a moment, in the way of a man who is deciding not to do the first thing that comes to mind. "G-H," he said. "Yes. That could stand for other things." "It could," Eleanor said. "But it appears in September's accounts 2 weeks after you sent the paperwork to remove Gerald from your operating account, and it appears under a payment category labeled Miscellaneous Ranch Expenses, which is the category least likely to be reviewed in detail during a routine audit." She paused. "And the amount, $14, is small enough that even a careful bookkeeper might pass it as a routine entry without cross-referencing." "But you did not pass it." "I cross-reference everything." Caleb looked at the entry for another long moment. Then he looked up at her. "The replacement bookkeeper Gerald sent from Denver. The one I sent back after 4 days." "Yes?" "He spent most of those 4 days on September's accounts specifically." Caleb's voice had gone very quiet. "I thought he was being thorough." Eleanor said nothing. She did not need to. Caleb pushed back from the table and stood. He walked to the window, not pacing, just moving, the way a contained man moves when he needs a moment to keep himself contained. He stood there for a few seconds, with his back to the room, looking out at the yard. "How much access," he said, "could a man with signatory authority on an operating account have if the removal paperwork was never processed? Enough to cause serious damage if he moved carefully and in small amounts over time," Eleanor said. "Small enough that each individual transaction looks routine. Large enough that over a year or two, the total would be substantial." "How would you find it?" "Bank records. Every transaction on that account going back to when the removal paperwork was submitted. Cross-referenced against the ranch operating costs I can verify from these ledgers." She paused. "It would take time, and you would need the bank to cooperate, which means going to Deadwood in person and presenting the discrepancies I have already documented as grounds for a formal review." Caleb turned from the window. He looked at her with the direct, undecorated gaze she'd come to recognize in the past few hours as his natural expression. No performance in it, no social management, just a man looking at a situation and deciding what was true. "Why are you telling me this?" he said. The question surprised her. "I beg your pardon?" "You came here this morning expecting to be refused. Your father's debt gets cleared either way. That was Gerald's promise. You have no obligation to this ranch, to these accounts, to any of this." He crossed his arms. "So why are you sitting at that table, telling me my brother may have been stealing from me, when the simplest thing in the world would have been to close that ledger, collect your payment, and go back to Deadwood with nothing but a routine refusal on the record?" Eleanor was quiet for a moment. It was a fair question. It was the kind of fair question she had not expected him to ask, which told her something about him that she filed away with the same careful attention she brought to everything else she had learned today. "Because the numbers were wrong," she said, "and I do not leave wrong numbers uncorrected. That is not a virtue. It is just how I am built." She looked at the ledger on the table. "And because, whatever Gerald intended this morning to be, it seems to me that someone who builds 4,000 acres from nothing deserves to know when someone is taking from him." Caleb looked at her for a long moment. Then he uncrossed his arms and came back to the table and sat down. "I want to hire you," he said. Eleanor blinked. It was the second time today she had been genuinely caught off balance, and she did not enjoy the sensation. I have work in Deadwood. 3 businesses that depend on my—" "I am not asking you to give up your work in Deadwood. I am asking you to finish what you started." He looked at the ledger. 3 months of accounts, properly reviewed and documented. A formal written record of every discrepancy. Something I can take to the bank and to a lawyer if it comes to that. His eyes came back to hers. "I will pay you. Real pay, not Gerald's debt arrangement. Whatever you are charging on Sherman Street, I will double it." The fire cracked and settled. Eleanor looked at the ledger on the table. She thought about the 3 businesses on Sherman Street, about the $4 left in her father's room, about the winter coming off the hills. She thought about Gerald's face in this room earlier, and the way he had tried to make her small with words, and found that she would not go small. 3 months of accounts, properly documented, she said. Formal written notation of every irregularity. Recommendations for what you should present to the bank and in what order. "Yes, I will need access to the filing cabinet Nora knows about, all original invoices, and the receiving logs going back to July." "You will have them. And if what I find goes beyond accounting irregularities, if the bank records confirm what I suspect about the operating account, I want it understood that my documentation goes to you, and you alone, not to Gerald, not to anyone Gerald has access to." "Understood." "Then yes," Eleanor said, "I will finish the work." Nora appeared in the kitchen doorway for the third time that afternoon. She looked at both of them, at the ledger on the table and the fresh agreement that had just been reached across it. And she moved to the cabinet against the wall, opened the bottom drawer, and produced a second, thicker ledger, along with a bundled stack of invoices tied with string. "Filing cabinet is organized by month, front to back, left side of the study," Nora said, setting everything on the table beside Eleanor. "Gerald does not have a key to the study. Caleb changed the lock last spring." Eleanor looked at Nora. "You knew?" "I knew something was wrong with the Henderson invoices in August," Nora said evenly. "I am not an accountant, and I could not have said where or how, but I know what this ranch costs to run. And August felt wrong. I told Caleb." She looked at him. "You told me I was probably right, and that you would look into it when you had a bookkeeper." "And then the bookkeeper Gerald spent 4 days on September," Caleb said. "And you sent him back before he could touch the files in the study," Nora said. She looked at Eleanor again, and the expression in her eyes had moved past the careful reservation of the morning into something more settled. "I haven't decided what I think of you," she said, "but I am revising the timeline significantly." Eleanor almost smiled. "I appreciate that." Nora went back to the kitchen. The afternoon moved around them as Eleanor worked. The filing cabinet yielded its contents methodically. Invoices in reasonable order. Receiving logs kept in Caleb's own handwriting, which was precise and economical. The handwriting of a man who wrote down what needed to be written, and nothing more. He worked at the far end of the table, while she worked at her end, going through correspondence and ranch records with the same focused attention she brought to the accounts. And they spoke when the work required it, and were quiet when it did not. And the quiet remained the same quality it had been at noon. Not empty, not uncomfortable, but the specific comfortable silence of two people who had found their working rhythm and saw no reason to disturb it with noise for its own sake. It was past 3 in the afternoon when Eleanor found the second separate payment. October. It had not been in the ledger she had been reviewing. It was in a supplementary record book she had pulled from the back of the filing drawer on the assumption that anything in the same cabinet was worth looking at. October 1st. Same category. Miscellaneous ranch expenses. Same initials. $31. More than double the September amount. She set the record book down next to the main ledger and looked at both entries side by side. September, $14. October, $31. The pattern of increase was not random. It was the pattern of a man who had tested a small amount, found it went unnoticed, and adjusted accordingly. "Caleb," she said. He looked up from across the table. "When did you last speak to someone at the Deadwood Bank about your accounts? In person, not by letter." He thought for a moment. "June, when I deposited the proceeds from the summer cattle sale and the operating account, the joint one with Gerald's signatory authority. Did you review the transaction history at that time?" "I reviewed the balance, not the individual transactions." "No." Eleanor turned the record book to face him and pointed to the October entry. She watched him read it. She watched him understand it. She watched his face do what contained men's faces do when they are confronted with a betrayal they should have seen coming but did not. Not shock, because some part of them had known, but the particular grief of confirmation, the moment when suspicion becomes fact and takes up permanent residence. "He is escalating," Eleanor said quietly. "Whatever he took in September was a test. October is the real amount. If this has been going on since the removal paperwork was submitted and never processed—" 4 months, Caleb said. 4 months at escalating amounts, using an account you believed had been closed to him. She did not soften it. He had not asked her to soften things, and she did not believe in softening numbers. "You need to go to the bank tomorrow morning, before Gerald has any reason to believe you have found this. You need the full transaction history on that account from July 1st to today, and you need to request that his signatory authority be suspended immediately pending a formal review. Caleb closed the record book. He set both palms flat on the table, the way her father used to do, when he was making a decision he had already made but needed a moment to fully commit to. He looked across at Eleanor. "Come with me," he said. "I beg your pardon?" "To the bank. Tomorrow." He met her eyes steadily. "You found it. You understand what it means better than I do in terms of how to present it. And the bank manager, Whitfield, he is Gerald's man socially. They have dinner together. They play cards." Something in his expression hardened slightly. "If I walk in alone with a ledger and a suspicion, Whitfield will tell me I am misreading routine transactions and suggest I speak to Gerald about it. If I walk in with documented discrepancies and a person who can explain each one specifically and in order, he cannot dismiss it as a misunderstanding," Eleanor said. "No," Caleb said. "He cannot." She thought about it for exactly the length of time it deserved, which was not long. "I will need to send word to my father tonight. He will worry if I do not return. I will have one of my men ride to Deadwood this evening. Your father can come out here if he prefers. There is room." Eleanor looked at him. "You would do that?" "It is not a complicated thing to do." "It is not a common thing either," she said. He did not answer that, but something in the set of his jaw changed in the way she was beginning to recognize the small physical acknowledgement he made when he had heard something and intended to think about it rather than respond to it immediately. The door opened. Not the front door, the back entry, the one that led from the yard to the kitchen. They heard Nora's voice, and then a man's voice, lower, and then Nora appeared in the kitchen doorway with an expression Eleanor had not seen on her face yet. Not the careful reservation of the morning, not the warming assessment of the afternoon. Something sharper and more alert. "Gerald is coming back," Nora said. One of the hands just rode in from the Ridge Road. Gerald's carriage turned around about a mile out. Caleb stood up from the table. "He did not go to Deadwood," Eleanor said. It was not a surprise. She had suspected it the moment Gerald had left with the exaggerated ease of a man who had decided to wait rather than withdraw. "He went far enough to be seen leaving and then stopped." "He wants to know what we found," Caleb said. "He wants to know what I found," Eleanor said. She picked up the main ledger and the supplementary record book and held them against her chest. "And whether he needs to do something about it before tomorrow morning." Caleb looked at her holding the ledgers, and then he looked at the door, and then he made a decision with the same quiet speed she had watched him make every decision today. No deliberation, no performance, just a man who knew his own mind. "Nora," he said, "take Miss Voss and those records to the study. Lock the door. Do not open it for anyone but me." "Gladly," Nora said. "Caleb." Eleanor stopped in the kitchen doorway and looked back at him. "Whatever he tells you when he comes through that door, he believes you found nothing. He needs to keep believing that until we are in front of Whitfield tomorrow morning with the documentation in hand. If he knows you have found the payments..." "He will move the money tonight," Caleb said. "Yes." Their eyes met across the length of the main room. The fire had burned low. Outside, the afternoon light was going gold and thin, and somewhere down the ranch road a carriage was coming back with a man inside it who had made a serious miscalculation and had not yet understood the full extent of it. "I know how to talk to my brother," Caleb said quietly. "Go." Eleanor went. She followed Nora down the short hall to the study, heard the key turn in the lock behind her, and stood in the dim room with the ledgers held against her chest, and her heart beating with the particular steady rhythm of a woman who had come here this morning to be dismissed, and had instead spent the day finding the thing that someone very powerful needed to stay hidden. Through the wall, she heard the front door open. She heard Gerald Hargrove's voice, smooth and warm and entirely in control of itself. And she heard Caleb answer him, easy, unhurried, giving nothing away. She set the ledgers on the desk, opened the one to the September entries, and in the remaining light began drafting the formal documentation that would walk a bank manager through exactly what had been done, in what order, and by whose hand. Her handwriting was precise and clear. It always was. She had learned long ago that the best weapon against a man who counted on not being caught was a woman who wrote everything down. Gerald Hargrove was a man who knew how to fill a room with comfort. He came through the front door with the easy warmth of a man returning from a brief errand rather than a strategic retreat. His hat in his hand, his expression arranged into something between apology and affection. And he looked at his brother standing by the fireplace and spread his free hand in a gesture that said, without words, that he understood he had overreacted earlier and was prepared to be reasonable about it. "I did not make it far," he said, turned around at the ridge. He set his hat on the hook by the door. Caleb noticed he took the hook next to his own, the habit of a man who made himself at home everywhere he went. "I was short with Miss Voss this morning. That was wrong of me, and I would like to apologize." Caleb looked at his brother and said nothing. Gerald moved to the fireplace and stood beside it, warming his hands with the ease of a man who considered every hearth in the territory his to stand at. "Where is she?" "Resting," Caleb said. "Ah," Gerald nodded slowly. "Long ride from Deadwood. Understandable." He looked at the table, at the clean surface, the ledger gone, the coffee cups removed by Nora at some point in the past hour. His eyes moved across the table once and came back to Caleb. "Did you two have a chance to talk, beyond the accounts business?" "Some." "And?" Caleb moved to the table and sat down. He leaned back in the chair the way he always sat, unhurried, taking up exactly the space he needed and no more, and looked at his brother with the expression that gave nothing away. "She found some billing irregularities in the Henderson invoices. Quantity discrepancies." Gerald's face was excellent. It did what it was supposed to do. Registered mild interest, a slight concern, the expression of a man hearing something mildly inconvenient about a supplier recommendation he had made in good faith. "Henderson? How significant?" "Significant enough to look into." "Well," Gerald pulled out the chair across from him and sat. "I am sorry to hear that. I recommended Henderson on good information, or what I believed was good information at the time. If his billing practices are sloppy, that is on me for not vetting him more carefully." He shook his head with the expression of a man holding himself accountable. "I will reach out to him directly. I know him well enough to have a frank conversation about—" "I would rather handle it myself," Caleb said. A pause. Very small, very controlled. "Of course. I only thought it might be simpler coming from me, given that I made the introduction." "I will handle it myself." Gerald looked at his brother for a moment. Then he nodded with the easy grace of a man who is accustomed to redirecting rather than surrendering. "Whatever you think is best." He settled back in his chair. "What about Miss Voss? Your assessment?" "She is competent." "More competent than I gave her credit for, it seems." Gerald's tone carried just the right amount of rueful acknowledgement. A man revising his opinion generously. "I may have misjudged the situation. I was trying to make a point, Caleb, not humiliate anyone. If she felt otherwise, I genuinely regret that." "Do you?" Gerald looked at him with the slight, patient smile of an older brother who had been managing a younger one for decades. "I know you are angry with me. You have been angry with me since I arrived. But I came here because I am trying to help you. and everything I have done, including this morning, has been with your interests in mind." Caleb looked at his brother across the table and felt the old, familiar weight of it. The years of this. The way Gerald had always been able to take any situation and fold it into a shape where his own actions became reasonable and his intentions became the only relevant fact. He had been doing it since Caleb was 16 years old, and he had been very good at it for a very long time. "I know what you came here for," Caleb said. "Then you know I want what is best for you. You want what is best for the Alcott land grant and the freight route it opens up." Caleb's voice was level. "I am the vehicle. The marriage is the mechanism, and everything else is management." Gerald was quiet for a moment. When he spoke again, the easy warmth had not left his voice, but something beneath it had shifted into something more serious, more direct. The voice he used when he had decided that the performance was less efficient than a frank conversation. "You are not wrong," he said. "The business interest is real, but so is my concern for you. Those two things can both be true at the same time." "They can," Caleb said. "But when they conflict, I know which one you choose." Gerald looked at his brother for a long moment. Then he looked at the table between them. And then he looked toward the hallway. And something moved across his face, very fast, barely visible. The kind of movement a man makes when he is recalculating and does not want to be seen doing it. "The accounts," Gerald said. "Miss Voss. How much did she review today?" "July and August," Caleb said. "She started on September before you came back." "And she finished September?" "She was working on it when you arrived." Gerald nodded slowly. He looked at the table again. "I think," he said carefully, "that before you take any of her findings to the bank or to a lawyer, you should let me have a look at them. Fresh eyes on the same numbers. Make sure there are no misinterpretations before you go making formal accusations against a supplier." "I appreciate that," Caleb said, "but I will manage it from here." The silence between them had a different quality now. Not hostile, not warm. The silence of two men who had stopped performing for each other and were simply looking at what was true. Gerald stood. He buttoned his jacket, picked up his hat. "I think I will stay in Deadwood tonight, rather than imposing on your hospitality further." His voice had returned to its smooth register, but the warmth was thinner now, like the last of the afternoon light. "Think about what I said, Caleb. About the Alcott girl. About the future of this operation. The offer will not remain open indefinitely." "I understand that," Caleb said. Gerald walked to the door. He stopped with his hand on the frame and looked back at his brother one more time. "Whatever you think of my methods," he said, "I am still your family." "Yes," Caleb said. "You are." Gerald left. Caleb sat at the table and listened to the carriage leave the yard, and this time he sat until the sound had entirely disappeared into the evening, before he stood up and walked down the hall to the study and knocked twice on the locked door. "It is me," he said. The key turned. The door opened. Eleanor stood at the desk with her documentation spread in front of her, 3 pages of closely written notes in her clear, precise hand, the ledgers open and marked with small paper slips she had torn from the back pages of her notebook. She looked at him with the alert, measuring expression of a woman who had spent the past hour working and listening through a wall at the same time. "He is gone?" she said. "For tonight." She exhaled, just slightly, just once, the single careful release of breath that had been held too long. Then she looked back at the desk. "He asked about the accounts." "Yes." "What did you tell him?" "That you reviewed July and August and started September." He came to the desk and looked at her documentation. "I told him you did not finish September." So he believes the October record book is still untouched. Eleanor set her pen down. That gives us until tomorrow morning. If he goes to the bank tonight to check the operating account. He will not go tonight, Caleb said. Gerald does not make visible moves when he is uncertain what the other person knows. He will wait to see what I do tomorrow before he does anything. He looked at the 3 pages of notes. You finished it. The formal documentation of every discrepancy across all 3 months, the 2 separate payments, and my analysis of the pattern. She turned the pages to face him. This is what you show Whitfield, in this order. You start with the billing irregularities, because those are verifiable against delivery records, and he cannot argue with physical confirmation logs. Then you show him the separate payments. Then you request the full transaction history on the operating account. She pointed to the last paragraph of her notes. I have written the specific language for the account suspension request. If Whitfield has any legal obligation to his depositors, which he does, regardless of his social relationship with Gerald, he cannot refuse a formal suspension request backed by this level of documentation. Caleb read through the pages carefully, the way he read everything, fully, without rushing. Eleanor watched him read and felt the quiet satisfaction of work that had been done correctly. The particular clean feeling of numbers that had been wrestled into their true order after someone had spent months arranging them into false ones. You wrote it in plain language, he said. Plain language is harder to misinterpret or dismiss, Eleanor said. Legal language gives a man like Whitfield room to say he needs to consult counsel before acting. Plain language with documented evidence gives him no such room. Caleb set the pages down. He looked at her across the desk with that direct, undecorated gaze that she had stopped finding disconcerting sometime around noon, and had since come to understand as simply the way he looked at everything he considered worth looking at carefully. You have done this before, he said. Not the accounts. This. Documented something that someone powerful did not want documented. Eleanor was quiet for a moment. My father was a lawyer for 20 years. I watched him build cases. I watched him lose them, too. Sometimes because the other side had more money, and sometimes because he had trusted the wrong person. She looked at the ledgers on the desk. When we came to Deadwood, and I started doing accounts work, I made myself a rule. Every discrepancy gets documented the same day I find it. Every pattern gets a written analysis before I close the ledger, because I learned from watching my father that the difference between justice and an outcome depends almost entirely on whether someone wrote things down. Caleb nodded slowly. He was quiet for a moment, and then he said, My father lost everything to a man he trusted, back in Missouri, when I was 15. Eleanor looked at him. He was not a bad man, Caleb said. Just not a careful one. He trusted without verifying, and it cost us everything. He looked at the wall, not at anything specific, the way people looked when they were seeing something that was not in the room. That is the thing Gerald has never understood about me. He thinks I am stubborn, that I insist on doing things myself because I do not trust other people's competence. He brought his eyes back to her. It is not that. It is that I need to understand the thing I am trusting someone with before I hand it over. I need to know what they can do and how they do it before I give them something that cannot be replaced. The fire in the small study grate had burned down to coals. Outside the window, the last of the daylight was going fast, the way it did in October on the high ground, without the long, slow fade of summer, but the quick, clean surrender of a day that had used up what it had. You trusted me today, Eleanor said. You showed me what you could do in the first 40 minutes, he said. That is not trust extended blindly. That is evidence evaluated correctly. She almost smiled at that. You make it sound like an account entry. Maybe it is, he said. Maybe that is all trust is. Enough correct entries that the pattern becomes reliable. Nora knocked on the open study door. She looked at both of them with the expression she had worn since approximately 2 in the afternoon. Not approval exactly, but something settled and satisfied. The expression of a woman whose long-standing private opinion had been confirmed by events. "Supper is ready," she said. "And your man rode to Deadwood an hour ago with a message from Mr. Voss." She looked at Eleanor. "Your father sent a reply back with him." Eleanor straightened. "Is he all right?" "He is fine. The reply is on the kitchen table." Nora looked between them. "Come and eat, both of you. You have been in here long enough." They ate at the long kitchen table, the three of them, with the documentation put away in the study and the locked door between it and the rest of the evening. Warren Voss's note was brief and characteristic. Careful handwriting, precise grammar, no wasted words. He was well. He was not worried. He was glad she had found useful work and asked her to give his respects to Mr. Hargrove when it was appropriate to do so. The last line read, "I trust your judgment in this as in all things." Eleanor read it twice and folded it into her pocket. Supper was substantial and quiet in the good way. The way meals are quiet when the people eating them have been through something together and do not need to perform for each other anymore. Nora served and occasionally inserted a sentence that was either practical information or dry commentary. And Caleb ate the way he did everything, without ceremony and with full attention. And Eleanor found herself thinking that she had eaten more meals in this kitchen today than she had eaten in the past 3 days combined, and that this fact was both embarrassing and deeply clarifying about the state of things on Sherman Street. After supper, Caleb showed her to the same spare room he had been using as an overflow sleeping quarters since the bunkhouse reached capacity in the summer. It was plain and clean, a narrow bed, a washstand, a single window facing east. Eleanor had slept in worse rooms in better circumstances, and had long since stopped measuring comfort against anything except whether she was warm and whether there was a lock on the door. There was a lock on the door. "We leave at 7, Caleb said from the hallway. "Whitfield opens the bank at 8, and I want to be there before Gerald has any reason to go in himself." "I will be ready at 6:30, Eleanor said. He nodded. He started to turn away and then stopped. He looked back at her with an expression she had not seen from him yet today. Not the measuring look, not the contained anger of the afternoon, not the careful strategic calm of the hour with Gerald. Something more unguarded than any of those things. "I want to say something," he said, "and I want to say it plainly, so there is no confusion about what I mean." "All right," Eleanor said. "When Gerald sent that letter to your father," Caleb said, "he chose you specifically because he believed you had nothing to offer. No connections, no money, nothing that would make you worth taking seriously." He held her gaze without looking away. "I want you to know that by the time you sat down at that table this morning, he was already wrong. And by the time you found the first irregularity, he was the most wrong he has ever been in his life." He paused. "That is not a small thing, Miss Voss. I have watched Gerald be wrong before. It does not usually look like this." Eleanor held his gaze for a moment. She had a standard response to compliments, a practical deflection, a redirect to the work. The careful armor of a woman who had learned that accepting acknowledgement too readily gave people a way to take it back later. She had been using that response for 3 years. She did not use it now. "Thank you," she said. Just that. No deflection, no redirect. Caleb nodded once. He turned and walked back down the hall, his boots quiet on the wooden floor, and Eleanor listened to the sound of his door close, and then stood in the silence of her own room for a moment before she moved to the washstand and began the methodical process of preparing for a night that she suspected would offer less sleep than its hours suggested. She sat on the edge of the bed with her notebook open in her lap, reviewing the documentation one more time in her head. The order of presentation, the specific language for the suspension request, the likely questions Whitfield would raise, and the answers she had prepared for each one. She had done this her whole working life, this final review before a difficult conversation, running the numbers until they were so familiar that no version of the next day's events could make her lose track of them. But somewhere in the middle of the review, her mind moved without permission to the conversation in the hallway, and the expression on Caleb Hargrove's face when he had said, "I want to say something plainly," and the particular quality of his voice when he had described how wrong his brother had been. And Eleanor Voss, who had been managing her own expectations with great precision for 3 years, recognized with the uncomfortable clarity of someone who dealt in accurate numbers, that something in her accounting of this day had not come out the way she had projected this morning. She had come here to be refused. That was the number she had arrived with. She was becoming less certain it was still accurate. Outside, the wind moved off the ridge in long, slow waves across the grass, and the ranch settled into its nighttime sounds. The horses in the barn, the distant voices of men finishing their evening work, the particular quiet of a place that was large enough to have its own atmosphere, its own weather, its own way of existing that continued regardless of what any individual inside it was thinking or feeling or recalculating in the late hours of an October night. Eleanor closed her notebook. She lay down on the narrow bed with her boots off and her thoughts still moving, and she did not sleep for a long time. And in the morning, they would go to the bank, and Gerald Hargrove would begin to understand the full extent of his miscalculation. And everything that came after would be determined by what happened when a man who had built 4,000 acres from nothing walked into a room with a woman who wrote everything down and never left a wrong number uncorrected. But that was morning. For now, the ranch was quiet, and the wind came off the hills, and Eleanor Voss lay in the dark and added up the numbers of the day one more time, and found that the total was nothing like what she had been sent here expecting. Eleanor was dressed and at the kitchen table with her documentation folder and her notebook before the ranch hands started moving in the yard. Nora appeared 10 minutes later, looked at her without surprise, and put coffee on without being asked. They did not speak for a few minutes. The fire caught and the kitchen warmed, and outside, the sky was the particular flat gray of an October morning that had not yet decided what kind of day it intended to be. "You sleep?" Nora asked. "Some." Nora set a mug in front of her and sat down across the table with her own. She looked at Eleanor with the direct, unhurried attention she brought to everything. "You nervous about the bank?" "No," Eleanor said. "The documentation is solid. Whitfield can question my interpretation, but he cannot question the numbers. The numbers are what they are." "I was not asking about the numbers," Nora said. Eleanor looked at her. Nora wrapped both hands around her mug and looked back with the expression of a woman who had earned the right to say what she thought and exercised that right sparingly enough that when she did, it landed. "I have been in this house 6 years," she said. "I watched 5 women come through that door. Every one of them was looking at something. The land, the money, the name, the idea of a man like Caleb Hargrove, rather than the actual man." She paused. "You looked at the ledger." "The ledger needed looking at," Eleanor said. "Everything needs looking at," Nora said. "Most people look at what they came to find." She picked up her mug. "You looked at what was there." Caleb's boots came down the hallway before Eleanor had to decide how to answer that. He came into the kitchen already dressed for town, clean shirt, dark vest, hat in hand, and looked at Eleanor's folder on the table and her untouched coffee and the expression on Nora's face, and he appeared to make several accurate assessments simultaneously without commenting on any of them. "Ready?" he said. "Yes," Eleanor said. They rode to Deadwood in the ranch wagon rather than the carriage, which Eleanor understood immediately was a deliberate choice. Arriving in Gerald's carriage would have announced them before they reached the door. The wagon was plain and unremarkable, the kind of conveyance that moved through a town without generating commentary. Caleb drove, and Eleanor sat beside him with a documentation folder in her lap and her notebook in her coat pocket, and the morning cold pressing against her face. They did not talk much on the road. What needed to be said had been said the night before, and what remained was execution. And both of them seemed to understand that there was a particular kind of preparation that required silence rather than rehearsal. It was the silence, Eleanor thought, of two people who had already decided to trust each other and were simply carrying that decision forward into the next hard thing. Deadwood was moving by the time they reached Sherman Street. Caleb tied the wagon 2 blocks from the bank, and they walked the remaining distance on foot, Eleanor matching his stride without effort, the folder under her arm. She had walked these streets for 3 years. She knew every board, every gap, every business whose accounts she had managed in the rented room above the dry goods store. She knew which men tipped their hats and which ones looked through her, and she had long since stopped cataloging the difference. What she noticed this morning was that the men who might have looked through her on any other day looked at Caleb Hargrove instead, and in looking at him, noticed her beside him. And the noticing had a different quality than she was accustomed to. Not because of anything she had done differently, because of who she was walking next to. She filed that observation away and did not examine it further until the business at the bank was finished. The Deadwood Territorial Bank was a solid, 2-story building on the main street, built to communicate permanence and reliability in a town that had spent its first years as organized chaos. Horace Whitfield had managed it for 11 years and had built his position on a combination of genuine financial competence and the careful cultivation of relationships with every man in the territory who had money worth managing. Gerald Hargrove was near the top of that list. Caleb pushed open the door and held it, and Eleanor walked in first. The bank was not busy at this hour. 2 tellers behind the counter, a clerk at a side desk, and Whitfield himself visible through the open door of his private office at the back, already at his desk, with a cup of tea and a stack of correspondence. He was a trim, gray-haired man in his late 50s, with the precise, contained manner of someone who had spent decades being trusted with other people's money and understood that the manner itself was part of the service. He looked up when they entered. He recognized Caleb immediately. A man with 4,000 acres and a substantial account balance was a face worth remembering. His gaze moved to Eleanor with the brief, calibrating look of a man assessing a situation. And Eleanor recognized the exact moment he placed her, not by name, but by category. The woman who kept books on Sherman Street. The Voss girl. The one without money. He stood anyway, because Caleb Hargrove's presence in his bank required standing, and came to the office doorway. "Caleb! This is an early visit." Warmth in his voice, genuine enough. The warmth of a man who liked Caleb Hargrove personally, even while managing his accounts professionally. His eyes moved to Eleanor. "Miss Voss." "Mr. Whitfield," Eleanor said. "Thank you for seeing us." "Of course." He stepped back and gestured toward the 2 chairs across from his desk. "Come in. What can I do for you this morning?" They sat. Whitfield closed the office door and returned to his own chair, settling into it with the practiced ease of a man on his own ground. He looked between them with the polite, attentive expression of a man waiting to understand what kind of meeting this was going to be. Eleanor opened her folder and set the 3 pages of documentation on the desk facing him. "I have been reviewing the accounts for the Hargrove Cattle Ranch," she said. at Caleb's request. I want to walk you through what I found, in order, and then I need to make a formal request regarding the ranch's operating account. She looked at Whitfield directly. I would ask that you look at each item before we discuss any of it. The documentation is clear, and I would prefer you read it yourself rather than having me summarize. Whitfield looked at the pages. He looked at Eleanor. He looked at Caleb. Caleb said, "Please read it, Horace." Whitfield picked up the first page. Eleanor sat still while he read. She watched his face the way she watched ledgers, not for what was intended, but for what was actually there. His expression moved through several stages. Initial polite attention, then a slight sharpening of focus, then the particular controlled stillness of a man encountering something he had not expected and was being careful not to react to prematurely. He read all 3 pages. He went back and reread the second one. He set them down on the desk with the deliberate care of someone handling something that had become, in the course of reading, more significant than it appeared from the outside. He was quiet for a moment. "Miss Voss," he said finally, "this documentation alleges a pattern of fraudulent billing by a ranch supplier and a series of unauthorized payments from a joint operating account using signatory authority that should have been removed in July." "Yes," Eleanor said. "The billing irregularities are verifiable against the ranch's physical receiving logs, which I have reviewed and which I can make available to you. The separate payments are documented in the ranch's supplementary financial records. The operating account suspension request was submitted by Caleb in July, and I need to know whether it was processed." Whitfield looked at Caleb. "You submitted a removal request in July." "I did," Caleb said. "By letter. I have a copy of the letter." Whitfield turned to his filing cabinet, the smooth reflex of a man who knew exactly where everything in his office lived. He pulled a drawer, found a folder, and opened it on the desk. He ran his finger down a column of entries. He stopped. Eleanor watched his face. "The request was received," Whitfield said. His voice had changed, not by much, but enough. The warmth had not gone, but it had been joined by something more careful. "It appears it was filed pending confirmation from both signatories. As Gerald Hargrove is the co-signatory, our standard procedure requires—" "Your standard procedure requires notification of both signatories," Eleanor said. "Not confirmation from both. Notification. There is a difference, and that difference is documented in the account terms Caleb signed when the joint account was established." She turned to the last section of her documentation and set it in front of Whitfield. "Page 3. The relevant language is in the 3rd paragraph." Whitfield read it. He set the page down. He was quiet for a long moment, and in that silence, Eleanor could hear the particular quality of a man revising his position against his preference. Not because he wanted to, but because the documentation did not leave him a comfortable alternative. "Miss Voss," he said, "where did you receive your accounting training?" "I trained myself," Eleanor said. "Over 3 years, working accounts for businesses in this town. Before that, I received general schooling in Philadelphia and spent 4 years reading every accounting and contract text I could find." She did not offer this apologetically. She offered it as a fact, the same way she offered every fact, without decoration or defense. "The documentation in front of you does not require my credentials to be accurate. It either reflects what the records show, or it does not. I would invite you to verify it against your own account records before we discuss any further questions about my qualifications." Whitfield looked at her for a moment. Then he looked at Caleb. "You are requesting a formal suspension of the joint signatory authority on account ending in 4471, pending the full transaction review from July 1st to present." "Yes," Caleb said. "And you are requesting the complete transaction history on that account for the same period?" "Yes." Whitfield folded his hands on the desk. He was a careful man, a thorough man, A man who had built 11 years of reputation on doing things correctly, and who understood, with the clear-eyed realism of someone who had managed money long enough to see what happened when institutions ignored documented evidence, exactly what was in front of him. "I will need until noon," he said, "to pull the records and process the suspension formally." He paused. "I will also need to note that this request has been made and the documentation submitted for the bank's records." "That is exactly what we want," Eleanor said. They left the bank at 8:47. Eleanor noted the time from the clock on the bank wall, because she noted times the way she noted everything. Automatically, precisely. Because information was only useful when it was accurate. She stepped out onto the street beside Caleb, and the flat gray morning had resolved itself while they were inside, into a cold, clear day, with the kind of light that made everything look exactly like what it was. Caleb stood on the boardwalk and looked at the street for a moment. He had said almost nothing during the meeting beyond confirming the account request, and she had not needed him to say more. And he had understood that, and let the documentation do what the documentation was built to do. That, Eleanor thought, was a particular kind of intelligence. Knowing when the best thing you could do was create the conditions and then get out of the way. "Your father's street is 2 blocks east," Caleb said. "I know." "You have time before noon." She looked at him. He was looking down the street with his hat tilted against the light, and his expression was the contained, unrevealing expression he wore most of the time. But she had spent enough of the past 24 hours watching that expression to understand that what it concealed was not absence, but restraint. A man who felt things carefully and released them only on his own terms. "Come with me," she said. He looked at her. "To see my father," she said. "Come with me." He came. Warren Voss was at the table when they climbed the stairs to the room above the dry goods store, dressed in his good coat, despite being alone. His papers organized in front of him with the meticulous care of a man who maintained order over the small things when the large things were outside his control. He stood when the door opened, and Eleanor saw his face move through relief, and then something more complicated when he saw the man standing behind her. "Papa," Eleanor said, "this is Caleb Hargrove." Warren Voss looked at Caleb Hargrove. He looked at him the way a lawyer looks at a man he needs to assess quickly. Reading posture, hands, the quality of the direct eye contact, the absence of performance. Then he looked at his daughter, and Eleanor saw him read something in her face that she had not been aware she was showing. And his expression shifted into something that was not quite a smile, but was adjacent to one. "Mr. Hargrove," Warren said, "I understand I owe you a debt of thanks. My daughter's note said you had been generous." "Your daughter did the work," Caleb said. "I provided the ledger." He crossed the room and shook Warren's hand, and Eleanor noticed that he shook it the way he did everything, without excess, without performance, just one man meeting another. "Your daughter is remarkable, sir. I want you to know that directly." Warren looked at his daughter again. She was looking at the window. "I have known that for some time," Warren said quietly. "It is gratifying when others catch up." They stayed an hour. Warren made coffee on the small stove, and the three of them sat at the narrow table, and Warren Voss and Caleb Hargrove talked the way two careful men talked when they were deciding whether to trust each other. Testing the edges of things, asking practical questions, listening more than they spoke. Eleanor sat between them and let it happen, and felt something loosen in her chest that she had not realized was clenched, a tension she had been carrying so long she had stopped recognizing it as tension, and had come to think of it simply as the way things were. At 11:15 they walked back to the bank. Whitfield had the transaction history waiting in a sealed folder. He had also prepared a formal suspension notice, signed and dated, removing Gerald Hargrove's signatory authority from account ending 4471, effective immediately. He handed both to Caleb across the desk. The transaction history shows 4 withdrawals since August 1st, Whitfield said. His voice was careful and precise, the voice of a man making a statement he intended to be on record. $14 in September, $31 in October, and 2 additional withdrawals in August, totaling $62. Combined with the supplier overbilling Miss Voss has documented, the total financial exposure is significant. He paused. I have also taken the liberty of placing a notation on Gerald Hargrove's personal accounts pending review, as a precautionary measure. Eleanor looked at Whitfield. Thank you, she said. Miss Voss? Whitfield leaned back slightly and looked at her with the particular expression of a man revising a category. I owe you an apology. Not for anything I said today, but for the speed with which I formed assumptions about your presence in this office. He was precise about it, the way a careful man is precise about an admission. The documentation you prepared is the most thorough and clearly reasoned account review I have seen across this desk in 11 years. I want that stated directly. Eleanor held his gaze. I appreciate that, she said. She said it the same way she had said it to Caleb in the hallway the night before, without deflection, without redirect, just the words, standing on their own. Gerald Hargrove arrived at the bank at 12:40. Eleanor and Caleb were still there. They had waited in Whitfield's office, not by arrangement, but by mutual, unspoken agreement that the thing was not finished until it was witnessed. Eleanor had her coffee and her notebook, and she had spent the 40 minutes since Whitfield's statement writing a final summary addendum to her documentation. A one-page overview, written in the plain, precise language she used for everything, that laid out the full pattern from first irregularity to final, unauthorized withdrawal, in terms that required no accounting knowledge to understand. She was capping her pen when she heard his voice in the bank's main room. Gerald's voice, warm and familiar, greeting the teller by name, the way a man greeted someone he had cultivated as a small, useful asset. Then a pause. Then the teller's voice, lower, and then silence. The office door opened. Gerald Hargrove stood in the doorway and looked at his brother and at Eleanor Voss sitting beside him with a folder in her hands, and at Horace Whitfield behind the desk with the expression of a man who had made a decision and was not going to be moved from it. And Gerald's face did something that Eleanor had not seen it do in the 2 days she had known him. It went still. Not the controlled stillness of a man managing his response. The involuntary stillness of a man who has walked into a room and understood in the first 3 seconds exactly what has happened, and exactly how thoroughly, and exactly how far beyond his ability to manage it now was. Caleb, he said. Sit down, Gerald, Caleb said. Gerald did not sit. He looked at Eleanor, and for the first time since she had crossed the yard of the Hargrove Ranch yesterday morning, the expression he turned on her had no warmth in it, performed or otherwise. Just the flat, unadorned look of a man who had underestimated something and was confronting the full cost of that mistake. You came here this morning, he said. Yes, Eleanor said. Before I could... He stopped. Before you could move the money, Eleanor said. Yes. The word moved through the room and settled. Gerald looked at Whitfield. Horace, whatever she has told you, the documentation speaks for itself, Whitfield said. I have reviewed it against the bank's records, and I am satisfied that it accurately reflects the transaction history. The suspension is processed, and the notation is in place. He paused. Gerald, I have a great deal of respect for you, and for what you have built in this territory. But I have been managing money in this town for 11 years, and I cannot look at these records and tell you that what I see is acceptable. Gerald was quiet for a long moment. He looked at his brother. Caleb stood up. He was not particularly dramatic about it. He simply stood up, the way he did everything, completely and without excess. And he looked at his brother with the expression that gave nothing away and said nothing that was not necessary and meant every word of what it said. The ranch accounts are going to be managed by Miss Voss going forward, Caleb said. The Henderson contract is terminated. The formal review of your access to my operating account will be completed by the end of the month. Whitfield will oversee it. He paused. And the Alcott arrangement is finished, Gerald. It has been finished. I need you to understand that clearly. Caleb. Gerald's voice had found a new register. Lower, without the warmth or the performance. The voice of a man talking to his brother at the bottom of everything. I was trying to build something, for both of us. The freight route, the land grant, it was all... I know what it was for, Caleb said. I understand the business.
I have always understood the business.
Something shifted in his voice, not anger, but something older than anger. The particular exhaustion of a man who has been managed by someone he loves for a very long time and has finally decided to stop being manageable. What I cannot accept is that you believed you had the right to take from me quietly because you had decided I was not making the correct choices. That is not partnership, Gerald. That is not family. That is ownership, and I am not something you own. The silence in that office had a different quality than any silence Eleanor had been in during the past 2 days. Not the working silence of the kitchen table, not the strategic silence of the study. This was the silence of something that had been building for a long time and had finally arrived at its full weight and was settling into the shape it would keep from here forward. Gerald looked at his brother for a long moment. Then he looked at Eleanor, and the look had changed again. Not warm, not cold, but something she had not expected. Something that was almost, not quite, reluctant acknowledgement. You came here to be refused, he said. Yes, Eleanor said. And instead He stopped, made a sound that was not quite a laugh and not quite anything else. My God. He picked up his hat from where he had set it on Whitfield's desk. He held it in both hands for a moment, looking at it. Then he put it on. I will be at the hotel on Main Street, he said to Caleb, when you want to talk about how to manage this without destroying everything we have both spent 20 years building. I will be there. He walked out. The door closed behind him. Whitfield let out a breath that he had been holding with great professionalism for the previous 4 minutes. I will have the formal review documentation ready by Friday, he said. Miss Voss, I would like to retain a copy of your summary addendum for the bank's records, if you are willing. Of course, Eleanor said. She handed him the last page she had written. Whitfield looked at it. I am also going to suggest, in my capacity as this bank's manager, that if you are ever looking to expand your accounts work beyond Sherman Street, the bank maintains a referral relationship with several operations in the territory that would benefit significantly from someone with your skill and thoroughness. He looked at her over the page. I say this as a professional observation. I will keep that in mind, Eleanor said. They walked out of the bank into the cold, clear afternoon. Caleb stopped on the boardwalk. He looked at the street for a moment, at the ordinary motion of a town going about its ordinary business, entirely unaware that anything had shifted. Then he looked at Eleanor. She was standing beside him, with her folder under her arm and her notebook in her pocket, and her worn brown dress and her calloused hands, and the particular quality of stillness she had when she had finished a task and was waiting to see what came next. I want to ask you something, he said, and I want to ask it plainly. I know, she said. He looked at her. You know what I am going to ask. I have been keeping accounts for 3 years, Eleanor said. I know what a pattern looks like when it is adding up to something. She held his gaze. Ask it plainly. Stay, Caleb said. Not to manage the accounts, though I need that too. Not because I need someone to fight my battles, though you have done that, and I am grateful for it in a way I do not have adequate words for." He looked at her the way he looked at everything he considered worth looking at carefully, with full attention and no performance. "Stay, because yesterday morning my brother sent you here to be dismissed, and instead you sat down at my table and showed me what it looked like when someone did the work and told the truth, and did not ask for anything except to be judged by what they actually were." He paused. "I have been waiting for that for a long time, Miss Voss. I did not know exactly what it would look like when it arrived, but I know what it is now that it is standing in front of me." Eleanor looked at him. She thought about the letter on a Thursday, the $87, the carriage ride through the frost, Gerald's smile in the yard, and the ledger on the table, and the locked study door, and her father's handwriting on the note. "I trust your judgment in this as in all things." She thought about 3 years of getting up every morning and doing the work and writing everything down and not letting the numbers be wrong, even when wrong was easier, even when no one was watching, even when the only person who would ever know was herself. She had not done any of it to be seen, but she had been seen anyway. "Yes," Eleanor Voss said. "I will stay." Caleb Hargrove looked at the woman standing beside him on the boardwalk of Sherman Street in the cold October light. The woman his brother had sent as a joke, as an insult, as the least possible option in a long strategy of manipulation. And he reached out and took her hand the way a man takes hold of something he has been looking for without knowing what to call it. And Eleanor felt the warmth of that grip travel all the way up her arm and settle somewhere in her chest where the cold had lived for 3 years. They sent the Poorest girl, thinking he would refuse. He said she was richer than gold. And they were both right. But not in the way either of them had understood when the morning began. Because the wealth between them was not counted in acres or accounts or the satisfaction of a fraud exposed and a wrong corrected. It was counted in the particular and irreplaceable currency of 2 people who had sat across a table from each other and looked clearly at what was there and chosen it, freely and without reservation, with their eyes completely open. That was the only kind of wealth that could not be taken, could not be forged, could not be altered by a clever hand in a column where no one was supposed to look. That was the kind that lasted.